High over the Japanese home islands in the summer of 1945, a B-29 superfortress held its course through the flak, and in the tail gunner's position sat a young American sergeant, watching the sky for fighters coming up to kill him. He was doing the same job thousands of American airmen were doing that summer, except for one thing that made him unlike any of them. The sergeant in that tail turret, firing at Japanese planes over Japanese cities, was himself the son of Japanese immigrants. His name was Ben Kuroki. He was a farm boy from Nebraska, and he was, as far as history records, the only Japanese American to fly combat missions over the land of his own ancestors. And to earn the right to be there, he had spent years fighting his own country. By that summer, Ben Kuroki had already flown 30 combat missions on the other side of the world, over Europe and North Africa, and had come home a celebrated hero, saluted in 1944 by Time magazine under a headline that captured the whole strange truth of him in 3 words: Ben Kuroki, American. He did not have to be over Japan at all. He had done his part several times over. He had volunteered for this, had in fact fought a second-long bureaucratic battle for the right to do the most painful possible version of his duty. To go and drop bombs on the country his own mother and father had come from. Almost no one would have blamed a Japanese American for declining that particular assignment. Ben Kuroki demanded it. Why he demanded it goes to the very center of who Ben Kuroki was and to the injustice he was living inside. Because, while Sergeant Kuroki flew 58 combat missions for the United States, 30 over Europe, 28 over Japan, roughly 120,000 people of Japanese descent, most of them American citizens, and among them people he knew, were locked behind barbed wire in American internment camps. They had been imprisoned, without trial and without evidence, for no reason other than their ancestry. Ben Kuroki's answer to that injustice was not to grow bitter and withdraw. It was to fly more missions than almost anyone to prove a point that should never have needed proving, that he was, exactly as Time had said, an American. He said it himself, years later, in one sentence that has followed him ever since. "I had to fight like hell," Ben Kuroki said, "for the right to fight for my own country." Sit with that for a moment. Most men who went to war had one enemy. Kuroki had 2, the Axis powers he was sent to bomb, and which tried to keep him on the ground the entire time, This is the story of how a farm boy from Hershey, Nebraska, beat them both. And it begins not over Japan, but with a recruiting office that did not want him. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like and stay with us all the way to the end. It began in the days after Pearl Harbor. When Japan attacked on the 7th of December 1941, Ben Kuroki and his brother Fred, like millions of other young American men, decided to enlist, to go and fight for their country. They drove to the recruiting office. And they were turned away because a recruiter looked at their faces and their name and questioned whether the children of Japanese immigrants could be loyal. The brothers did not accept that. They got back in the car and drove roughly 150 miles to a different recruiting office, and there a different recruiter signed them up. That is how Ben Kuroki got into the United States Army, by refusing to be told that his own country was not his. Getting into the Army was only the first barrier. Kuroki wanted to fly, and the Army Air Forces did not want soldiers of Japanese ancestry anywhere near an aircraft. The policy effectively barred them from flight crews. Kuroki, assigned at first to clerical and ground duties, simply refused to let it go. He pushed and volunteered and pushed again, and eventually, through sheer persistence, earned a place he was not supposed to have. A slot as an aerial gunner on a B-24 Liberator heavy bomber bound for the war in Europe. His crew, to their great credit, took him in. Whatever the policy said, the men who flew with Ben Kuroki came to regard him simply as one of their own. The air war was murderous, and it did not care about anyone's ancestry. Flying out of England and North Africa, Kuroki's bomber group went into the flak and the fighters again and again, and the losses were staggering. The life expectancy of a bomber crewman, statistically, was only a handful of missions. Kuroki flew far past it, and on the 1st of August 1943, he flew one of the most infamous missions of the entire war. The low-level raid on the oil refineries at Ploesti, in Romania, Hitler's oil, flown at rooftop height into a wall of fire. It was a catastrophe of a mission. Something like 310 airmen in his group alone were killed. Kuroki came through it. We have told the story of that raid itself elsewhere on this channel. Here, what matters is that Ben Kuroki was there, in the sky, an American gunner over Hitler's oil. He nearly did not survive it. On his 30th mission over the German city of Münster, flak tore into Kuroki's gun turret and shattered it, and he lived only because, seconds before the burst, he had happened to lean back into the body of the aircraft. There is a famous photograph of him afterward, a young man holding the smashed plexiglass dome that should have killed him. 30 missions was more than enough. It qualified him to go home for good. And by then Ben Kuroki was genuinely famous in America, hailed as the first Nisei war hero, written up in time. He had proven everything he set out to prove. He could have stopped. Instead, he asked for the hardest thing left to ask for. Before we get to what he asked for, we have to talk about what the army asked of him in between, because it is one of the strangest and most morally complicated assignments any American hero was ever handed. Kuroki was now a celebrated, decorated Nisei airman, and someone in the War Department realized he was useful. So they sent him on a speaking tour of the internment camps. They sent Ben Kuroki, in his uniform with his medals, into the barbed wire compounds where his own people were imprisoned, to stand up in front of them and encourage the young men to volunteer for military service, for the segregated Japanese-American unit, the 442nd. Think about the position that put him in. He was asking people who had been stripped of their homes, their businesses, and their freedom, locked up by their own government purely for their ancestry, to go and risk their lives for that same government. Many of the young men in those camps were, understandably, in no mood to hear it. There was real and principled resistance to the draft inside the camps from people who felt they should not have to prove a loyalty that should have been assumed. Kuroki's answer, the thing he believed and argued, was that the way to defeat the prejudice was to serve so visibly and so well that it could no longer be denied. Reasonable people in those camps disagreed with him. It was, on every side, an impossible situation with no clean answer. The country did notice him, and that is its own kind of remarkable. In 1944, with tens of thousands of Japanese Americans still behind wire, Time magazine ran a feature on Ben Kuroki under the headline, "Heroes, Ben Kuroki, American," insisting, in print, at the height of the war, on the plain fact of his Americanness at exactly the moment his country was busy denying it to people who looked like him. He was invited to speak to civic groups. He became, improbably, a symbol, a living argument against the very policy that had tried to keep him grounded. But Ben Kuroki did not want to be only a symbol on a stage. He was a gunner, and there was still a war on, in the Pacific, that he had not yet been allowed to fight. And the Pacific was the one place the United States absolutely did not want a Japanese-American airman to go. Fighting Germany was one thing. Putting a man of Japanese ancestry in a bomber over Japan itself, where, the fear ran, he might be shot down and his loyalty questioned, or simply where his presence made everyone uneasy, was another entirely. The policy was a flat no. So Ben Kuroki, who had already flown 30 missions and survived Ploesti and a shattered turret and had every honorable reason to stay home, began his second great fight with his own government, for the right to go to war against the country of his own blood. How he won it came down in the end to a single letter, and to the kind of stubbornness this whole story is made of. If this is the kind of history you want kept alive, subscribe. We make these to keep exactly these people from being forgotten. Kuroki appealed and kept appealing, and eventually enlisted the help of a Nebraska congressman who took his case all the way to the top, to the Secretary of War himself, Henry Stimson. And Stimson, reviewing the record of this Nisei sergeant who had already done more than his share, personally signed off on an exception. Ben Kuroki would be allowed to fly against Japan. He kept that letter, framed for the rest of his life, the piece of paper that granted him the right to risk his life for his country a second time. And so Ben Kuroki went to the Pacific, to the island of Tinian, and joined a B-29 crew as a gunner, and flew 28 missions over the Japanese home islands. This was the strategic bombing campaign against Japan in its final, terrible phase, and the B-29s were burning the hearts out of Japanese cities, raids that killed enormous numbers of Japanese civilians. Ben Kuroki flew those missions. He did his duty, and unlike almost anyone else in those aircraft, he was bombing the country his own parents had been born in, the cities where, in some abstract sense, his own relatives might have lived. He did not pretend it was easy. He was honest about it, in a way that does him great credit. "It bothered me a lot," he said later, "of the bombing, all the women and children." And then, because he was a soldier in a war he believed had to be won, he added the hard second half. But it was war. Both halves of that are true, and Ben Kuroki lived inside the tension between them. He was an American doing his sworn duty against an enemy nation, and he was a human being with a conscience, grieving the civilians beneath his bombs, some of whom shared his ancestry. He did not resolve that contradiction with a slogan. He simply carried it, honestly, for the rest of his life, which is, perhaps, the most that can be asked of anyone the machinery of war puts in an impossible place. When the war ended, Ben Kuroki had flown 58 combat missions across 2 theaters and half the world, one of the most flown gunners of the entire war, and the only Japanese American ever to fight in the air over Japan. But to understand the full weight of what he had done, and why it took so much fighting simply to be allowed to do it, we have to go back, past the B-29s and the medals and the time feature, to a farm on the plains of Nebraska, to a family of Japanese immigrants, and to the December morning that turned every Japanese American in the country overnight into a suspect. Ben Kuroki was born in 1917 and raised in Hershey, Nebraska, one of 10 children in a hard-working family of Japanese immigrants who farmed the land like their neighbors. He was, by every account, an ordinary American kid of the rural Midwest. He grew up on the farm, played, worked, and thought of himself, without complication, as exactly what he was, a boy from Nebraska. His parents had come from Japan and built an American life. The Kuroki children were American citizens by birth. There was nothing in Ben Kuroki's upbringing that marked him as anything other than one more son of the American heartland, until the wider world decided on a single day that his face made him an enemy. That day was the 7th of December, 1941. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, a wave of fear and fury swept the United States, and it fell hardest on the roughly 120,000 people of Japanese descent living on the American mainland, most of them citizens. In early 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, and under its authority, the government forcibly removed Japanese Americans from the West Coast and confined them in remote internment camps behind barbed wire and guard towers. They lost their homes, their farms, their businesses, and their freedom. Not for anything they had done, but for who their grandparents had been. It remains one of the gravest violations of civil liberties in American history. This is the country Ben Kuroki volunteered to fight for, a country that, at that very moment, was imprisoning his community and questioning the loyalty of every person of Japanese blood within its borders. It is why the recruiters turned him away, why the Army Air Forces barred men like him from flying, and why the Pacific was closed to him, not because of anything he had done, but because of a blanket suspicion attached to his ancestry. Understanding that is the key to the whole story. Every barrier Ben Kuroki fought through, the recruiting office, the flight ban, the closed door to the Pacific, was built out of the same fear that had put 120,000 innocent people behind wire. He was not just fighting to fly. He was fighting the idea that his face made him less than American. So when you picture Ben Kuroki back in that B-29 tail turret over Japan, picture all of it behind him. The farm in Nebraska, the recruiter who said no, the second recruiter 150 miles away who said yes, the barred cockpits, the flak over Ploesti, the shattered turret, the camps full of his own people, and the letter from the Secretary Free of War that he had to fight for just to be allowed back into danger. Knowing all that, the plain fact of him, a Japanese American doing his duty in the sky over Japan while his country imprisoned his community, stops being a curiosity and becomes something close to heroic on a level that has nothing to do with medals. And what happened to him when he finally came home says everything about why he had to fight so hard in the first place. What happened when he came home is the bitterest irony in the whole story, and it has to be told, because leaving it out would flatter a country that had not yet earned the flattery. Near the end of the war, back on American soil after 58 combat missions, Ben Kuroki was in a barracks when a drunken fellow serviceman, an American, called him a racial slur and attacked him with a knife, gashing his head badly enough to require some 24 stitches. 58 missions against the enemies of the United States, and one of the most dangerous moments of Ben Kuroki's war came from another American on home ground because of his face. It is a hard note, but it is the truth, and it is exactly the thing he had spent the whole war trying to defeat. It did not break him. Ben Kuroki went to the University of Nebraska on the GI Bill, earned a degree in journalism, and became a newspaperman. Reportedly the first Japanese American to edit a mainstream American newspaper, and spent a long, quiet, decent career at papers in Nebraska, Michigan, and California, retiring in 1984. He had made his life the argument his whole war had been that he belonged, and slowly, over decades, his country came around. He was celebrated by the Japanese-American community, given an honorary doctorate, made the subject of a public television documentary, and in 2005, at the age of 88, the United States Army awarded Ben Kuroki the Distinguished Service Medal, one of the nation's highest honors. At that 2005 ceremony, an old man now, Ben Kuroki, repeated the sentence that had defined his life. I had to fight like hell for the right to fight for my own country, and then he added 4 words he had waited more than 60 years to say, and I now feel vindication. Technical Sergeant Ben Kuroki, the farm boy from Hershey, Nebraska, who flew 58 combat missions over Europe and Japan, who survived Ploesti and a shattered turret and a knife in an American barracks, who stood in the internment camps in his uniform and argued that service was the answer to hatred, and who was the only Japanese American to fly in combat over the land of his ancestors, died in 2015 at the age of 98. He had outlived the prejudice. He had made his point. Ben Kuroki spent the Second World War fighting 2 enemies at once, the ones his country sent him to bomb, and the ones at home who insisted a man with his face could never truly be one of them. He beat both the only way he knew how, to be anything other than what he had always been. Time magazine got it right, words in the middle of the war, when almost no one else in 3 words, in the middle of loud, when almost no one else would say it out loud. Ben Kuroki, American, he simply spent his whole life making the rest of the country agree. More than 30,000 Japanese Americans served in the United States military during the Second World War, many of them while their own families were held in the camps, and their stories are among the most quietly astonishing of the entire war. Maybe your family carries one. If your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, anyone in your family was a Nisei serviceman, or served in the Army Air Forces, or was held in the camps, or served anywhere in the war in any role, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did, or said, or one thing you remember. The people who had to prove they belonged deserve more than a footnote. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.